Xerxes' fury had subsided,
he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her.
The king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king.
Let the king appoint commissioners to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa.
let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti.
This advice pleased the king.
And he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar.
Mordecai and his cousin Esther
This young woman, Esther,
had a lovely figure and was beautiful.
Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died.
when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put in the care of Hagar.
Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hagar, who had charge of the harem.
She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food.
He assigned 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her
and her attendants into the best place in the harem.
Esther had not revealed her nationality nor family background.
Mordecai had forbidden her to do so.
Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening.
Before a young woman's turn came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete
12 months of beauty treatments.
6 months with oil of myrrh,
6 months perfume and cosmetics.
This is how she would go to the king.
Anything she wanted was given her.
In the evening, she would go, and in the morning, she would return.
She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name.
When the turn came for Esther,
she asked for nothing
other than what Hagar, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her.
Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins.
he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti.
Wait a minute, he did what?
He set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti.
I don't know if I like this king.
The king gave a great banquet.
Esther's banquet.
He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces.
And distributed gifts with royal liberality. That's better. It's better.
During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate,
2 of the officers who guarded the doorway became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes.
But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai.
when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles.
All this was recorded in the book in the presence of the king.
After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman,
Elevating him
Giving him a seat of honor.
higher than that of all the other nobles.
All the royal officials at the king's gate
knelt down and paid him honor. To Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him.
Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor.
Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai,
Why do you disobey the king's command?
Day after day, they spoke to him.
He refused to comply.
for he was a Jew.
When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down to pay him honor, he was enraged.
Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews.
Throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
Then Haman said to King Xerxes,
There is a certain people dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate.
Their customs are different.
They do not obey the king's laws.
It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them.
Let a decree be issued to destroy them.
I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury.
So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews.
Keep the money, the king said to Hiram, and do with the people what you please.
Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews.
Young and old, women and children, on a single day.
The 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day.
The couriers went out, spurred by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa.
The king and Haman sat down to drink.
But the city of Susa was bewildered.
Well, thank you all very much for that wonderful dramatization of this pretty neat book. The book of Esther was written somewhere around 200, 400 BC, and it was actually written in a time when the Greek Empire was oppressing the Jewish people in very significant ways in their homeland, in Israel. And it was set, as you know, in Persia, in Susa, and when there was a time when there was persecution for the Jews in that setting as well. And so the book was written, pretty much the whole of the book was written to answer this one simple question, to provide help for the people of Israel, the people of God, to know what do the people do when government officials and government policies are unwelcome, they are unwanted, they are unwarranted, they are unworthy of our obedience and our loyalties. The book was written for such a time as that. But it is also helpful for us in such a time as this, because of course, right, we are asking similar questions. Or we probably have asked those questions in the past, and if you haven't done either one of those, well, you probably are going to in the future. What are we to do when there are policies or there are public figures, officials that rule over us, and we are supposed to obey them? So we're going to try to get some of the answers. We won't get all of the answers to that question because that's why we're doing a series, but we'll get some of the answers to that question here from this interchange between Haman and Mordecai. Mordecai is the good guy in the story, okay? And Haman is the bad guy. He is the villain. So we are going to learn what to do mostly from Mordecai's behavior, although we'll learn a couple things that we might not do. And then we certainly are going to learn a little bit about what's not appropriate from Haman. So let's get right to it. I'd like for you to, we're going to be going through the scriptures, so if you have your Bibles, please open them. And I'd like to first look here at Esther chapter 2, verse 5 and 7. And we're going to look a little bit about the character, the person of these two main characters that are our hero and our heroine of the story, Mordecai and Esther. And what we see in chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, is sort of a genealogy of Mordecai and Esther, who they are, and a little bit of insight into the kind of people they are and why we ought to give them respect, why we ought to maybe model some of our behaviors after these two people. What we learn is that as I said, we're set in the citadel of Susa, and we're looking at a Jew. This Jew is named Mordecai, and Mordecai is from the family of Benjamin. Okay, that's very important. You'll learn why here in a little bit. But he's from the tribe of Benjamin, which was one of the smallest tribes of Israel. And a number of kings came from the tribe of Benjamin. And his name, as we said, was Mordecai. And he is a descendant of some of the descendants of persons who were brought into Babylon during the exile. When the Jews were sent into exile from Israel into Babylon, his great-grandfather Kish, and then his grandfather and father, they sort of ended up here in this place called Susa, and they've lived there as Jews in exile for a good number of years. So we're not thinking that Mordecai is like 120, 140 years old, okay? He's probably middle-aged like many of us, and we learned that he has this cousin named, it says here her name was Haggadah, okay, but her name ends up being Esther, Haggadassa, and her name, her Assyrian name, or her Persian name, becomes Esther, and that's how she's known through the rest of the book. Well, she has some really difficult times. Her parents die. She's probably in Israel, and we know that because it says that Mordecai brought her up, right? So he brings her up from somewhere. We don't really know where. The interesting thing about the book of Esther is it says things very generally about a lot of things, and the reason is because it wants us to ask questions. The book of Esther is generally read during the Feast of Purim, which celebrates this, and generally groups of people get together over and over again during this celebration, and they read the entire book together, all at once. That's how it's supposed to be read. Now, we're breaking it up, but they read the whole book together, and then they sit around and they eat and they drink and they talk about what does it mean. That's what they do. They ask questions. So that's why all these questions pop up. What is bringing her up from where? Where did she come from? How did she get here? Well, we don't really know, but she's there with Mordecai, and he, though he's a cousin, an older cousin, he raises her like a daughter. And what it says then, sort of as a conclusion of this, is that Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father died, and that later what we find out about Esther is that she has this beautiful, this awesome figure. This is how she's described. She has a lovely form, figure, and she is beautiful. Now, what are we supposed to understand about that? Well, what we're supposed to understand is that not only is she a beautiful person outwardly, that's the lovely figure, but she's also beautiful inwardly. In other words, the idea that the Jewish persons would get from this is that she had been raised in a godly way. And we learn that later in the story, and we won't spend too much time there. But clearly, Mordecai had raised her up to be a good Jew, a good Jewish woman. In many ways, like the Jewish women that are described in Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 is this wonderful proverb. The whole chapter is about these virtuous women and how they are good for their husbands and how they are good for their people. And they're wise, and they're dutiful, and they're respectful, and they're moderate. There's an interesting interplay in this whole book about the excesses of the Persian government and the excesses of all that they do, and then how moderate and responsible and proportionate Esther is. That's an interplay. And so it seems like that Mordecai has raised this woman up to be a Proverbs 31 woman. Okay? And so that's going to play into this. Now, it's important for us to sort of begin to glean some learnings from this. So knowing what we know that's coming in the story, and knowing what we know about Mordecai and what we're learning here, there's a learning that we can gather as the people of God, and that we're supposed to gather as the people of God. And that learning is that it's important as the people of God to take care of our family. To take care of our families when there are difficulties. And even more important is that we're to raise our children up in godly ways. And you know why? Because in the end, we're going to really be glad we did. Right? In the story, we learn that Mordecai and frankly the whole people of God are really glad that Mordecai raised Esther up to be a godly Jew, because she ends up saving all the people. And so this is some of the things that we're beginning to learn. We're beginning to learn that it's important as the people of God that we take care of our family when we're going through hard times. And it's important to raise up our children in godly ways, because it's better for them, it's better for us, and it's better for the people of God. And actually we learn it's better for the society in the end. Now, later on, we skip down to this chapter 2, verse 21 through 23, and we begin to see this story unfold, this plot of valor and honor and standing up to authorities and rules that are just not quite right. And we see this wonderful act of valor on the part of Mordecai and Esther. And so if we look at this, we see that in verse 21 that during the time Mordecai, and this is after Esther has become the queen, she's in the king's home. After that, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now, we are not to understand that Mordecai is just sort of sitting there hanging out, kind of just chilling by the gate. Okay? That's not what we're supposed to understand here. When it says that he was by the gate of the king, he was in service to the king. He was part of the king's government, basically. And what we know is because of what's going to happen, where he overhears some pretty sensitive information, right? 2 eunuchs that are going to try to kill the king, that are in the king's bedchamber, actually, so that they would have had access. So he hears this sensitive information, so he's placed within he has a good government job, basically, is what we're talking about. And so he's there, and he overhears that. And so that's what we are to understand when it says that he was sitting at the king's gate. He was at work. He overheard in the other cubicle, right, a conversation between 2 colleagues on the phone. And they were discussing how they're going to get rid of the boss. And so Mordecai says, well, that doesn't seem right. And so he goes and he tells Esther that this is going to happen. And then Esther goes and tells the king, and just note that she doesn't take credit where credit isn't due. She gives credit to Mordecai for overhearing this. And the king, checks things out, makes sure that what he's saying is true, and then, kills the 2 guys and puts their heads on a pole, which is kind of gross. But that's what the story says to happen. And then, it's written down in this book that is the history book that the king, we learn later, kind of reads on an ongoing basis. And that's going to become an important part of the story too. So it's recorded, it's written down, it's verifiable, it's documented. Okay? And so, what do we expect? We expect that somehow Mordecai is going to be honored for this. That Mordecai is going to get the respect of the kingdom, that Mordecai is going to get the respect of the king, and it's going to just be awesome. We expect it to be a 2 or 3 chapter book, right? But look what it says there in chapter 3. In chapter 3, it says that after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agite. Now, I didn't tell you one thing because I kind of forgot, so I want to go back to that. One of the learnings from what Mordecai and Esther do is important for us to capture here before we go on, before we talk about the fact that he's not honored. Jeremiah 29, was what Jeremiah the prophet wrote to the Israelites who were in exile. He wrote them a very interesting letter, and that letter is documented in Jeremiah 29, 4 through 6. But basically what it says is that while you are in exile, you are supposed to build houses, and you're supposed to get jobs, and you're supposed to give your sons and daughters off into marriage. In other words, you're not supposed to just completely separate yourselves or exile yourselves from the society that you're in. You're supposed to, what basically it says is contribute to the good of the city and the nation and the society while you're there. And so one of the reasons that Mordecai probably does what he does when he hears about this situation of the king getting ready to be killed is because he probably has been steeped in this Jeremiah understanding. And the Jeremiah understanding, which is our second learning here, is that we as the people of God are to give our full support to those God has appointed to govern over us for as long as we can. We are to give our full support to those that God has appointed over us in government for as long as we can. And so, Mordecai saves, and Esther saves the king's life. Even though he was kind of a wretch, he was manipulated by all kinds of bad people. Nonetheless, he was sort of the one appointed, and so they support him. That's the second learning. So, moving on then to chapter 3, we see Haman being honored. And what we begin to see is this act of now civil disobedience on Mordecai's part. Why is Mordecai doing what he's doing? I mean, we've already seen him have this attitude, this Jeremiah 29 attitude of fully supporting the government officials that are appointed over him by God. Okay, so we've got that, and we know from other texts that even the Hebrew scriptures talk about Nebuchadnezzar being the servant of the Lord. So he's got this attitude over here, but now what we see is that Haman is the one that's honored. So we wonder why was Haman honored here? What's up with that? What happened? And what we see in this chapter is that now Mordecai, as opposed to fully supporting the government officials, now he's living in defiance. I mean, he's being very, very disrespectful. He is acting in civil disobedience. The law was that everyone was supposed to bow down to Haman, the Agagite. Bow down to Haman, the Agagite. And Mordecai would not kneel. So we have to ask the question, of course, why does Mordecai not bow? Good question. Glad you asked. Well, first answer could be that he was really committed to God, right? There are some supplementary texts that say that recount that Mordecai might have said that he would serve no man, but he would only serve God. Okay, but that's kind of in an extra biblical text, and at least in this story that we have, it doesn't say that he said that. It says, that he just wouldn't bow down, and so we wonder, why isn't he doing this? Some of us might think that bowing down to people might be against Hebrew Scripture, but actually it's not. Actually, there's nothing in Hebrew Scripture that says we can't bow down and show honor and respect to our leaders. It says don't bow down to other idols, but there's clearly times in the Scripture where people do show respect and bow down to kings and queens and respected persons. So it's probably not that. Maybe Haman wore an idol. Maybe that was it. Maybe he was wearing an idol, and so Mordecai couldn't bow down to him because Haman was embossed in an idol, and so then he would be bowing down to an idol. But, of course, the story doesn't tell us that either, right? So that's just a simple assumption. So that's probably not a best choice. Maybe Mordecai was stubborn and just proud. And maybe he was a little. Most men are. But we see that Leroy, we know you're not. But what we see is that that's not really the character of Mordecai, right? I mean, he doesn't seem like that kind of a person, at least according to the story. So that's probably not a good option. So maybe the only thing that we can assume is that there was history, some sort of history, bad history, between Haman and Mordecai. And this actually is the best answer. And why might we think that maybe there was bad history? Well, because we know that Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin, which was the tribe that the first king of Israel came from, Saul. And we know that Mordecai is an Agite, which means that he is from the family of Agag, who we know in 1 Samuel 15 was the king of the Amalekites, who are very nasty, unruly, just despicable kind of people that God commanded the Israelites and Saul to completely annihilate, even down to the animals. And what we know from 1 Samuel 15 is that Saul decided that wasn't a good idea, and so he doesn't kill Agag. And what tradition says is that Samuel does come eventually and kill Agag, but tradition says that his queen, his wife, actually got away, and that she was pregnant, and that the Amalekite family of Agag, the Agites, actually continued and prospered and ended up aligning themselves with the Persian government. So, if this is true, which there's some pretty good reasons why we might consider that, because they mention Benjamin and they mention Agites, we begin to understand maybe why Mordecai was so reluctant to bow down to this Amalekite, who was a descendant of this wicked king. That the people of Israel were told to annihilate, but they didn't. And so he's there because of the unfaithfulness of Saul, right? And why Haman would be so energized by not only killing Mordecai, but killing the whole Jewish people. Begins to enlighten and illuminate our story a little bit. So again, we learn two things from this about how do we behave as the people of God when faced with government officials and policies that we feel uncomfortable about obeying or giving loyalty to. And it speaks a little bit to being the faithful people of God too, and in very difficult and strategic situations in history. And there are two things that it teaches us. One, it teaches us that we might not ought to hold grudges for too long, because it's bad for everyone. I mean, suppose Haman hadn't have held this grudge forever. You know, we assume always that what he did was the right thing. But we need to at least assume that maybe some of the Jewish people might have thought that wasn't a very good idea, to hold that grudge against Agag and the Amalekites for so very long, because the result of Haman's action is that he puts the people of God at great risk. So how does the stubbornness of a people play into some not so pleasant things happening in the people of God? And Probably if we've been in the church for very long, we recognize that that does happen. A second thing that I think plays even more into this story is that we, as the people of God, in those very strategic, important situations, we need to make sure that we are making faithful choices in our lifetime. Because if we don't, our ancestors are likely to pay the consequences. You've heard the verses that talk about the sins of the father are passed down to the third and fourth generations. The consequences of a certain father's behavior is then, means bad things down the line. Well, this is what's happening here, folks. Saul's really bad behavior, his lack of faithfulness in regards to a very, very clear command of God, results in the people of God being at great risk from the descendant of that king. And it is directly due to the lack of faithfulness of Saul in that situation. And so it's important for us to think and really realize, come to terms with how we behave as the people of God today, how we behave as individual followers of Jesus Christ today, isn't just about us. And it doesn't have consequences just for us or just our generation. The decisions that we make as the people of God and the church today will have lasting effects. Whether they are positive or negative, they will have lasting effects. And we all know, I think, that this is true. So why does Mordecai not bow? It is an act of civil disobedience based on who Haman was and what Haman was doing in the kingdom at that time. He was probably very much in support of the wars and putting down all the insurrections that were happening in the kingdom at that time. And so maybe he was involved in that. We don't really know. But what we do see is that Mordecai does take a stance. He does stay standing in a very obvious way, in a very civil, disobedient way. Civil meaning, respectful, but disobedient meaning making a stance. And that begins to change the system, just as Vashti's no begins to change the system and change the outcome for all of the people. And so what we learn, I think, from Mordecai's behavior is that as the people of God, even when it's very difficult, we need to stand up for what is true and godly when necessary, even in the face of great opposition. And remember that God will come when the time is right. A lot of very difficult, hard things have to happen until there is salvation. But nonetheless, he makes a stance and he stands to it. Well, this story goes on, and if we look at Esther chapter 3, verse 8, we see the results of Haman's civil disobedience. Haman begins to talk to the king, and he tells one truth and two lies about the people of God. And it's going to be interesting, I think, for you particularly who are Mennonites, to hear the one truth and the two lies. Because I think it pertains to us as a people of God. And the one truth and two lies is that the one truth is that their customs are different. They're just an odd folk. I mean, they look different. They act different. They behave different. They're very family-oriented. They have one God. They have different customs and practices. They're different. And we know that is true. But then he goes on and he says two lies. They do not obey the king's laws. Sorry for that misspelling. They do not obey the king's laws. But we know that they were, right? I mean, we know that they were. They just weren't obeying Haman and submitting to him. So that's a lie. It's not true. And they do not have the best interest of the king in mind. And again, that's not true, because Mordecai, on behalf of the people of God and the Jews, actually saves the king's life, right? And so the question then also becomes, is Mordecai standing up to Haman in the best interests of the king? Or is what Haman is doing in the best interest of the king? Haman sort of suggests that what he's doing is in the best interest of the king, right? But if we look all the way down to the bottom of the chapter, of chapter 3, what does it say? It says they send all these edicts. They say they're going to kill the people. They say they're weird people. They don't obey the king's laws. They don't have the best interest of the kingdom in mind. And what does all of society looking on say? They say it seemed odd. You see, they knew that something wasn't right about this. They didn't really know what it was, but they knew that something wasn't right about this. And you see, that's what always kind of happens when we stand up for what is right and what is true in acts of civil disobedience, as conscientious objectors. There is this phrase that I found as I was doing the study of this, and it's this quote that I found from Schopenhauer, who was a German philosopher. It says that all truth passes through 3 stages. The first, it is ridiculed. Secondly, it is violently opposed. And thirdly, it is accepted as being self-evident. And that's what's happening in this story of Esther. And in my opinion, it is what happened, or what might still be happening, in this whole idea of conscientious objection to military service. This is a quote. You can read it from actually some Mennonites who were in one of the camps as they decided not to serve in a war because it was against their conscience. And most of you know about that. Most of us here know about our Mennonite history and tradition. So I won't go too much into that. But we know that this was violently, many times, opposed. And the question is, are we at the third stage where it is accepted as self-evident that as Christians we ought not to kill one another? Are we at the place where that's a self-evident truth? Probably not. And so I pose you a question. As we think about the results, the social good that happened, as many of you were involved in voluntary service, or alternate service as it was called, during these wars, as we think about the good that was produced in society that is still working its way out and sustainable, does that tell us anything about the quality of that decision and whether or not it was a good one and a godly one? My perspective is that wars keep on going and people keep on fighting them for the same reasons. Seems to me that way. And it just keeps happening over and over again. On the other side, I know that a lot of you participated in health reform and prison reform and medical rehabilitation reform, when you were involved, forestry reform, agricultural reform. And what I know about that is that those positive benefits of your efforts in that work are lasting. They stuck. And they've made our society and our world a better place. The conflict resolution that is taught at Eastern Mennonite University is world-renowned, known. People travel from all over the world because somehow, by our conscientious objection and our willingness to take a stand against policies and government people who might not have the best interests of society in mind, they flock to learn, what does it mean to be a people of peace in very difficult situations? And what does it look like to have practiced that for over 500 years? Many of you could probably stand up during the sharing time and tell us all kinds of wonderful stories about that. I think you should. And I think we should learn from you. Because what we see is that when people do the kinds of things that Mordecai and you did, the people of God are healthier, and we as a society are healthier. So let me conclude here with the learnings. Take care of your family and raise your children up in godly ways. In the end, you'll be glad you did. Give your full support to those God has appointed to govern over you for as long as you can. Don't hold grudges for too long. It's bad for everybody. Make sure you make faithful choices in your lifetime. If you don't, your ancestors may pay the price. And stand up for what is true and godly when necessary. Even in the face of great opposition, God will come to your aid and show your works as true in the end.